Well, hello, it's good to be with you for this webinar, looking at how to pivot into a pioneering mindset. My name is Ed Olsworth-Peter. I'm the National Advisor for Pioneer Development for the Church of England. And my role within the Church of England is to oversee a strategy to double and double again the number of pioneers. A really wonderful goal. So encouraging lots and lots of different people to pioneer in different ways. And today in this session, we're going to think a little bit about how you might pivot into pioneering mindset. What does it mean to pivot? What is pioneering, and how could we move into that kind of mindset that might be helpful in these times? I wanted to start by talking about Brighton. I don't know if any of you have been to Brighton, but I grew up very near Brighton and love the sea, and it's just a brilliant, vibrant city, and I always love going back to visit when we're allowed to. And in Brighton, as you might know, there are two piers. There's the Brighton Pier or Palace Pier, and then further down a little bit on the West Beach is the West Pier. And piers have a really interesting history. I think originally they were places that were very simple. They were just a place for people to fish, but also as tourism and industry often revolved around the coast. It was the quickest way to move materials around the UK was often by sea. If you had a pier, it meant that the larger ships could dock and they could then access the town. So without the pier, you were kind of cut off because the ships couldn't land with goods or with tourists. And then as time went on, particularly, I guess, in sort of Georgian, Victorian times, piers became very fashionable places to go, to be seen, to socialise. There were places of entertainment. And I wonder, because perhaps it gave a different perspective of the sea. You're kind of in the sea, but not having to get wet. Always good if it's cold. But also, I think it gives a different perspective of the land. You can see your life perhaps in a different way. It's sort of an escapism, but also a sense of stepping into the other. But the West Pier, over many years, for lots of reasons, has fallen. It's dilapidating. It's kind of falling into the sea, and that's due to, I think, funding. There's been a fire or two fires on the pier, which has meant it's just not able to be restored. But because it's listed, it's not allowed to be pulled down. So it's just rusting into the sea. The frame is there now in the middle of the sea, but the bit of pier that connects the land to the frame has gone. All the wood has gone. It's quite sad to watch, really. But what is really interesting, and the point of the story, is that the pillars that hold up the bits that have now fallen into the sea are still there. They're really strong. And in a way, things have pivoted. So in the old original entrance to the West Pier now is something called the I-360. It's the British Airways version of, it's called the Donut. And it's the equivalent of the British Airways Millennium Wheel in London, if you know that. But rather than a wheel, it's a huge circular viewing platform, like a massive donut that goes up a huge column, a massively high column. And in a way, it's pivoted. One thing has kind of fallen into the sea, but actually they've, in a way, I think, borrowed the idea of column, which is still really strong, but actually placed it on the land this time. And rather than going out into the sea horizontally, you're kind of going out into the sea vertically. It still gives you a different perspective of land. It could be a place to socialize, but really it's that sense of escaping to the other, moving into an other place that helps you think about life in a different way. And also that the columns have now been, some of them, put onto the land to create an amazing installation. So there's all this kind of interplay of what was, what is, what could be, but the sense of pivoting from one thing to another, but still really resonating with the kind of key ethos of pillar and different perspective. Pivot perhaps is a rather overused word now, isn't it? I'm told, I'm not a sports person, but I'm told that it's a basketball term where you're on your heel and you can pivot and choose to go in different directions. You can move your foot to point in the direction you want to go, but you're still keeping your heel on the floor. So you're pivoting, working out where to pass the ball to. And I wonder, in the world today, perhaps in the life of the church, we're in a pivoting space, aren't we? A pivoting place. It might be that actually for some people, there's a call to pivot, to do something slightly different in a different direction. Why is that important to do that? Well, I think the first question perhaps to think about is the difference between doing something better and doing something different. The Palace Pier in Brighton, by contrast to the West Pier, actually is still there. It's really successful. There's an amazing fomper at the end. You can stroll along it. There's refreshments. You can socialise. I don't know the economics or the reasons behind it, but that pier is still there, and it's a good place to go to. So it might be that sometimes we need to do things better, and actually just by thinking a little bit differently, but developing what's already there, we can actually grow something that works. But for others, it might be that you need to pivot, like the West Pier example, and actually go in a different direction and do something different. I sometimes give lectures at theological colleges for theology students, including pioneer students, and quite often get people to think about 4 words, thinking about mission in the 21st century. The idea, looking at these 4 words of belong, believe, behave, and become, and ask them to think about what order or how would they arrange those 4 words that would perhaps best describe a missional journey of somebody coming to faith in 2021. And I remember I trained to be ordained in the Church of England about 20 years ago, nearly. And I know at that time we would say probably it's about belong, believe, and then behave. So there might be a sense of joining or a church congregation or being engaged in something like a Christianity Explored or Alpha course, and then finding a sense of faith through that, which many have, millions have, haven't they, through things like Alpha. And then through that, you might then be transformed, of course, and then you might change the way that you live out your life. But I think increasingly that isn't always the case. And this word become, I think, is really important as well. There's various ways you can define those words. Behave might mean something quite rigid and following instructions, perhaps in, again, sort of Victorian expressions of church that perhaps were more rigid than now. But it can also mean something that's the outworking of an inward journey, can't it? Belong might be something that you do at the beginning, or could be a quite light touch thing of tagging along. But also it could mean belonging wholeheartedly as a baptized believer to the family of God. There's all kinds of things that it could mean. So you have to kind of work out what you think. But really the conclusion of the conversation often is, well, actually, there's many different routes. It's not a straight line of putting the words in the right order. It's more of a circular shape of diagram where actually any combination of those words could be someone's journey into faith, which makes me think, well, maybe there might be something different. We might need to think differently as well as doing things better. And the third thought into why we might need to pivot is around the idea of desire lines. And I need to credit my colleague in the Church of England, Heather Cracknell, who thought of this a while ago. It's a really great analogy. So thanks to her for this. A desire line, often you can see it in the world around you, is an unofficial pathway. If there's, say, a corner on a street and there's a concrete path, a tarmac path that goes around the corner at an angle, and there's a piece of grass, sometimes people will choose to walk across the grass diagonally rather than do the whole of the corner. And if lots of people do that over time, then you create an unofficial path. And those are called desire lines because there's a desire to walk in a different direction or a new path that is different from the one that's been mapped out. And I just wonder if we need to pay more attention to our missional desire lines. Sometimes as church leaders, we can do lots of listening and make some fantastic plans. And sometimes those are the right plans. But a lot of times, maybe we might need to look a little harder and see, well, where are people actually walking? And perhaps we need to pivot and move into those spaces because that's perhaps where people might be more than where we think they might be. So we're going to think a bit more about pivoting and pioneering. And first thinking a few theological thoughts, then thinking about 15 principles, which sounds like a lot, but I'll list them all and then you can think about them later, about pioneering principles. We're then going to think a bit about how that might be lived out. And then finally, just some reflections on life in the pandemic that we've been doing as a community of pioneers nationally. So I wonder if there's a few theological themes perhaps that really underpin what might be meaning to pivot and in this pioneering way. There's something about the church being self-giving, or the theology of being broken and given away. We see that very much, don't we, in the death and resurrection of Jesus. He was broken, died, rose again so that we could have a new relationship with God, a fundamental center part of our gospel message, isn't it? And in a way, perhaps the church is also called to break itself off and give away, not to destroy itself, but actually in a sense of gift. There might be things that the church needs to break off and give away so something else can grow. We see that in nature. Sometimes things shed in order for other things to grow. Maybe like a dandelion, where you blow the seeds and actually they all scatter to different places to grow more dandelions, rather than just keeping that dandelion in one clump. As a child, it was just too tempting not to blow the dandelions, and we loved doing that as kids. So maybe there's something about being self-giving as a church, rather than just holding everything tight, and maybe being something that can be gifted, that could be the making or start of something else. The second thing I think is around the idea of difference. And there is something, isn't there, that actually unity doesn't necessarily need to involve uniformity. Actually, there's a lot of value in things being different but connected together. And if we think about the Trinity, a complex piece of doctrine, but I guess in simple terms, obviously Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, God is one and three in one. But that sense that actually when one person of the Trinity may have had a more prominent role, think of creation or Pentecost, actually, as we know, the other two persons of the Trinity are also involved. So when one acts, all three of them are acting together. But actually, there are different aspects, aren't there? Different personas of the Trinity. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit have particular roles, maybe in some ways personalities, but they all are one God, all different facets of one God. So I wonder if that sense of identifying difference in unity is actually quite important in our pivoting, so that we're not mavericks who are rushing off to edge spaces and just leaving everything behind. There's something very important about being the body of Christ. The hands need to be connected to the arms, the ears are connected to the head, and I think the tendons are really important. So as a story, as an aside, about 3 years ago, I had a horrible accident with my thumb. Just still, it looks like this. It doesn't work properly anymore. I was carrying some glasses up the stairs and I tripped and the glass went into my thumb and completely severed the tendon in my thumb. It was horrid. So I had to have lots of surgery and physiotherapy to reattach the tendon. It makes me feel a bit queasy still thinking about it. But it made me think how important tendons are. It's not just about being stuck together as the body. We need the tendons to move the different parts of the body. And it's not just the thumb that moves itself. It's the tendon and the muscle and the brain sending signals to those muscles and tendons. So it's a whole act together. So that difference is part of unity as well. And maybe that leads to the third thing, that idea of interdependence. What does a theology of interdependence look like? Not in an unhelpful way, but as in nature, there'll be diversity in ecosystems and there'll be interdependence, different species relying on the other. Think about birds eating fruit from trees. Through their body, they'll discard the seeds that come out the other end of the bird, but that helps to propagate more of the plants to grow. It helps to feed the bird. We kind of need each other, don't we? It's not about being a lone ranger. So maybe those themes of giving, difference, and interdependence might be a really important bedrock if we're thinking about pivoting. Another story. So in the spring-summer lockdown, it was beautiful weather, wasn't it? If you remember, it was where we are in the southeast, and there wasn't much to do. We live in the countryside. So my 6-year-old son wanted to learn to ride his bike. So we took opportunity of the really quiet village we lived in to go and do that with nobody really around, which was a good opportunity. And it was just an interesting process. He wanted to ride his bike. I remember him saying, "Oh, could you just leave one of the stabilizers on?" when I was taking the stabilizers off. And I was saying, no, you really can't do that, because it's actually more dangerous to have one stabilizer than no stabilizers. Also, we realized that you need a good, flat, safe space to learn to ride your bike. If you think back to when you may have learnt to ride a bike or have taught someone to ride a bike, actually there's certain conditions that you might need, aren't there? And having a good, flat, safe, maybe slightly bouncy space is probably a good thing. So we went to our village green where there was really dry, short grass at that time. That was a good place to learn. We also experimented with a hill which had a very unfortunate bunch of stinging nettles at the bottom of it, which he really unfortunately careered into and really stung his legs. That delayed us by a good week. He knocked his confidence, which was horrid. But yeah, you need a good flat space. You also need, I think, just somebody with experience. So I'm not an expert bike rider by any means, but I've been riding my bike for a long time, and so I could share my own experience with him, which was helpful. Also, the way that you might teach someone to ride a bike could be different, couldn't it? I first started by just riding alongside and trying to get him to watch me. That didn't really work. I then tried sort of running alongside. That didn't quite work. And the best way, as you'll know, is to hold the back of the bike and the handlebars and to do that running along and then gradually letting go, sometimes without them realizing. So trust was really important as well. And motivation was pretty key. So he needed to know that the reason it was good to learn to ride his bike was because he could go riding his bike with me, but also when he was allowed to, he could go and perhaps ride his bike with some of his friends in a safe place. So those themes of riding a bike actually bring us into some of the principles that we might need to pioneer. That sense of learning from experience, taking a risk, doing it in a safe space, being with somebody else who's also on the journey, and having that sense of time and trust. So I'm going to run through these 15 things. They group into sets of 5 things, groups of 3 of 5 things. So the first set are spiritual foundations. The second set would be inward qualities. And the third set are outward practices. And if you think of them a bit like a tree, like a fruit tree, the spiritual foundations will be the soil and the rock. The inward qualities are perhaps the roots. It's all going on under the surface, and perhaps a little bit of the trunk. And then the outward practices might be the fruit on the tree. So spiritual foundations. Here are the 5 things, and then I'll just explain them briefly. So to be Jesus-centered, to be called, to be bicultural, to be a person of prayer, and to be someone of responsive obedience. So being Jesus-centered, fairly obvious. Actually, this isn't just doing lots of wonderful imaginative things. We want to be disciples who make disciples. We want to share the good news of Jesus in our lives with others and to help people to come to faith. That's pretty what it's all about, pretty key. But a sense of how you're called to do that. And I think we have pioneers who are all types of different people. Some pioneers are paid full-time, some are part-time, some are ordained, some are lay people, some are doing it in their spare time, some are doing it where they live, some are doing it where they've moved to as part of their work. So all different types of people. But all of them have a sense of being called to do this in a slightly different way. I'll explain what that is in a minute. But as well as that sense of being bicultural, so be able to cross cultural boundaries or move from one cultural boundary to another. And George Lings has written a little bit about this. He used to work for Church Army, in the sense that perhaps Jesus' incarnation was a little bit bicultural in a very different way to us as humans, obviously, but a sense of Jesus being human and divine, of heaven, of earth during his incarnation, and able to cross between those worlds in a way. So then the 4th thing is prayer. Prayer is key to anything. And I think if we pray, God can work through us and things happen, don't they? Prayer is key. We know that. And then lastly, responsive obedience. So in our listening and prayer and discerning what God might be doing, it's that sense of being obedient to God. It's God's work, not our own work. As a pioneer, as a creative person, I know sometimes I get very carried away with lots of brilliant ideas and the excitement of creating new things. And sometimes it's easy to lose track that actually this is not about us using our amazing gifts to do something brilliant. It could be that, but it's actually about responding to God and what he is saying, listening and doing, which may be different to what we think. Sometimes God has a much better way of seeing things than we do, doesn't he? So those are 5 foundations that are probably important to start with those things if you're wanting to pivot into a pioneering mindset. Then moving up the tree, so into the sort of roots and the early bits of the trunk, there are 5 inward qualities that might be things you want to cultivate before you start even doing anything. And perhaps now it's really important to say what I would describe a pioneer is. Would have been helpful perhaps earlier on, but this is a good point as well. So we would say in the Church of England, pioneers are the first to see and creatively respond to the Holy Spirit's initiatives. They're doing that by gathering around people who are in the missional context, people that they're meeting in the world around them, where they live or where they're called to minister, allowing people to hold their doubts and walk with them, all on a journey together, forming community. So gathering around those people and forming a community with those people, and together over time, loving and serving them, working out how they can be part of the journey as well, to all people to say together, what would church look like for us? And out of that, you will get then people who start forest church, cafe church, running church, or anything you can think of, really, missional communities, new monastic missional communities, all kinds of things that are really describing that context and those people, but with a Jesus-centered, absolute Jesus-centered focus, with those 5 foundations that we just talked about. So that's what pioneers do. It's a going and staying approach, which is slightly different to come and see approach, where we might already have an expression of church, or we're running a missional outreach project in some way. We're connecting with people, talking about faith, and then we invite people to come to what we're already doing. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying pioneers do things in a different way. It's going and staying and doing that work out there, with co-creating with the people who are out there. So the inward qualities are helping people to think about how they can start to do that, but doing the internal work first. So the 5 inward qualities are discerning, self-giving, playful, hospitable, and resilient. And I'll just explain those really briefly. Discerning is fairly obvious. It's about discerning what God is saying, discerning the world around you, discerning what you're feeling in yourself as well, but always taking it back to God in prayer. Self-giving is about maybe putting your own preferences sometimes aside in order for the good of what you need to do in that place, and it connects again to responsive obedience. It's not about totally emptying yourself and being someone that you're not. It's that sacrificial way of journeying as a disciple of Jesus, putting him and the work of God first. Playful is a word that's being used a lot more. It's a wonderful word, and really playful is about I guess being open to the unknown, not having a plan in mind as you start. It's maybe trying to be in a constant mindset of play. If you think about the way that children learn, they actually learn a lot through playing. They might be in a constant state of play, but they're learning, doing different things as they play, as it goes through. I know our children very much do that. But as adults, we say to children sometimes, oh, it's playtime now, or okay, you can go and have some time of play. Actually, they don't work like that. They're always just thinking, observing. They're non-judgmental about what's going on. Sometimes playing is enough. That maybe isn't an outcome, but they've learned something through the play. That's really important to cultivate that attitude of playfulness. Being hospitable, really important. So what does it mean for God to be hospitable to us and us to be hospitable to others? It's about welcome. It's about radical welcome, isn't it? There might be issues of social justice, community cohesion in there as well, as a sense of serving, I think, in that hospitality. But it's doing something else. It's not just saying, I'm going to be a brilliant host and how can I serve you? That's wonderful. It's also saying, actually, I want to empower you, the people around me, to be hosts. And I am the guest. Everyone's a guest. Everyone's a host. And Jesus, if you look at him in the Gospels, often subverts guest and host. If you think about the story of Mary and Martha's house, he's there as a guest, but ends up hosting the conversation, as we remember in the story. And at the Last Supper, he's there as the host of the meal, but actually ends up washing their feet. And so isn't just a guest, but actually is a servant of the 12 who are gathered there. So there is something about thinking about hospitality in a different way. Maybe that's a sacrificial way again. And resilience is pretty key, because I think this stuff is quite hard to do. What is in your spiritual tank? What can you draw from when things are tough? Where do you go to with God when things are difficult? We need that spiritual resilience if we're going to pivot into a pioneering mindset. And then finally, the third set. So we're moving into the branches and the apples of the tree, but it's an apple tree. Thinking about outward practices. And so these 5 things are noticing, adapting, experimenting, co-creating, and persisting. And really quickly, just to explain those. So noticing is really doing some amazing listening and noticing to the world around you, to God, to those. But it's a bit different to discerning, because often I'm trained as a coach with 3D coaching, which is a wonderful way of learning to be a coach. And we were often taught to notice without diagnosing. Sometimes we listen with a hypothesis or a question, and we're kind of wanting to prove the answer we might have. But actually, proper noticing is simply just being open in an unbiased way to what are you going to see around you, and over time allowing that to permeate to work out what it might mean. Adapting is really, I guess, about pivoting in a way. It's about saying, well, how can I change what I'm doing to fit better with what needs to happen? And Johnny Baker has talked about us sometimes having a sweet tooth, perhaps a spiritual sweet tooth, or a missions-shaped sweet tooth, or a church-shaped sweet tooth, things that we would be our natural go-to thing, the kind of music that we like to listen to, our preference of how we might worship, the way we might like to engage in our community. And they may well be really good things. God's made us in a particular way, hasn't he? He has made us to be who we are and wants to use us. But perhaps we also need to be open to adapting and being agile and adapting our spiritual practices in order to best fit with the community that we're within. And that might, again, be about being bicultural. If you think about back to the root again, it's about trying to span different worlds. Experimenting, probably fairly obvious, but about taking risks, about being willing to go into the unknown, trying things out, seeing what happens, journaling, noticing what happens when you test and try things out, learning, sharing, talking, all that kind of stuff. Often the best learning, isn't it, from experiments, is when it doesn't work out, or it goes in a different direction to the way you thought, and you discover something new. Being prepared to not to fail, but being prepared to see things in a different outcome, and saying that's okay, it's an experiment, we can learn, we've learned something really valuable, really important for pivoting into a pioneering mindset. Fourthly, co-creating, which connects against to some of our other themes, but it's back to that idea of actually not just doing it all yourself and inviting people to it, but really living and inhabiting the lives, values, and experiences of the people around you, and really offering that sense of being a facilitator and an enabler of others, so that we're all saying, well, what would this look like for us? What would our community that we're building look like for us? What would worship look like for us? What would church look like for us? So the pioneer there is really about enabling others, raising up and spotting other people who might be pioneering or have potential as a pioneer in this way of working, rather than just doing it and then leaving and then getting people to get on with it. It's that sharing and co-creating. And finally, persisting, which really is about courage, perseverance and courage, to do things perhaps that might be a bit scary or out of your comfort zone, but to keep going, drawing on the resilience from within in order to grow what God's calling you to do. So lots and lots in that, 15 things, but really key, I think, to start from the soil, the roots, up to the trunk, and then to the branches, and then to the fruit, rather than just jumping straight to the fruit. And I think we've noticed, thinking about pioneering over the last while, that perhaps we've described pioneer ministry as more about what people are doing rather than who they are. And that's, I think, helpful in some ways, but I think we've got to start with who we are. I think that's key. And then it will become something authentic. And I think God can grow some strong foundations. So just to sort of bring this into context, I think we're seeing people pioneering in all kinds of different ways. Some people are doing this, they're paid to do it full time. Some people might be part of a church community, and their role is very specifically to go into the community and stay there and grow new forms of church in that way. But they're still connected to their local church in doing that. Others might be more standalone pioneers, hopefully still with accountability and a connection into the body, with the tendons working like we talked about earlier. But I think we're really seeing a rise of the entrepreneurial pioneer, and particularly, I think, through the lockdown, as people are wanting to and maybe having to be more creative in the way that they pioneer things, as in all sorts of life. So we're seeing people more and more, I think, thinking about startups. What would a startup project look like as a new Christian community? Or what does co-vocation look like? So rather than seeking to be paid or doing it in your spare time in that sense, maybe it's about having some other kind of work, paid work, that then enables you to do the pioneering, I guess, in a traditional tent making model. But more than that, maybe the work that's going on in the community that's earning you the money could also be part of embedding into the community. If you're working in your local shop, for example, actually meeting people who come in and out could be a great way of forming connections with people just as you're chatting at the counter or whatever. I mean, there's loads of different examples, aren't there? And increasingly, I think a crowdfunding approach to pioneering, where you're asking people, generating income from all sorts of small amounts of donors, a bit like overseas missionaries have done for many, many years. I think we're seeing quite a lot of that going on. And those kind of entrepreneurial ways of pioneering are more risky, definitely. There's more that could be lost in that sense. But in some other ways, it's also very creative. And I just wonder if in taking that leap, it might help also release something else in the pioneering. Again, there's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's equally good to do it in your spare time. It's equally good to be paid to do it. You just got to work out what's right for you. But it's been interesting to track the entrepreneurial way of doing things. And I think just to finish off, just sharing a few thoughts from the lockdown. We have a community of pioneers called the National Anglican Pioneer Network in the Church of England. And there's lots and lots of pioneer networks around the country and in all sorts of denominations. This is just the one that I'm part of. And we've just been doing some chatting about what are we noticing during the pandemic. And I don't think these things are necessarily specific to pioneers, but might be helpful if you're thinking about how to pivot into a pioneering mindset. The first thing we noticed early on is that maybe being is the new doing. And so the apple tree analogy is quite helpful, but it's quite a doing-based analogy. It's all about an active space for the fruit. It's about the result is things that you do. But actually, maybe increasingly a lot of our ministry, all kinds of ministry, might need to be in that inward space. A bit like a potato, where actually the produce is under the soil. So things like accompaniment, journeying with people, really in-depth conversation, that might be the activity. It's not necessarily putting on a great big event and getting people to come to it, or co-creating an event and doing that. That's powerful too. But I just think that internal being sense of ministry might be really important in this next season, and not just once the pandemic is finished. I think there's going to be a lot of time, isn't there? Months, maybe years of everybody processing what's going on. I think that being is going to be really important. The next thing we noticed was about the idea of curating as well as initiating. So sometimes there's a tendency, with people who've got lots of ideas to start loads of things. And that is great, that we want people to do that. That's really important. But particularly, in this world of lockdown, where as communities, we've been grounded in many ways. We've been stuck at home, but also we've perhaps been more earthed into our local community. We've got to know our neighbours better because we're on our daily walks. We're having to help each other a lot more because of all sorts of things we can't do now. A load of amazing things have happened, haven't they, in our communities, of the way that communities have rallied, they've started things, they've seen a need and met the need. And so I think it would be a bit odd to then suddenly come along as a pioneer or any church leader actually and say, oh great, we've seen that need too, let's start something in parallel. Doesn't really make much sense unless you're offering something totally different and there's a gap you've spotted. So what does it mean to join in as a Christian, as a person of faith, as a leader with what's already going on? Be part of it, join the movement in that sense of your local initiative. And in that, be the person of God, reveal the Holy Spirit, reveal who God is in that place. Maybe do it that way. Or often church leaders are pretty connected to the world around them, aren't they? They're really great at initiating community in that sense. So maybe it's about curating and joining the dots of different initiatives that are going on in your community, and maybe offering that strategic approach in that way. So you may not need to always start something, but maybe somebody else has already done it, but how could you be part of it in a different way? So the third thing we noticed was about lament, which again, I think it's a really universal theme for now. All kinds of loss around, isn't there, during this pandemic time, of people losing loved ones in terrible circumstances, but also in losing money, in losing jobs, losing time, losing mental health, losing space, all kinds of loss going on. And I think we're going to have to take quite a while to process that, aren't we, as a community, maybe as a nation. So I think there's something about allowing spaces of lament to happen. And again, maybe pioneers, any church leaders, in fact, actually can initiate that. I'm sure people already are, just opening a space, maybe a sacred space for people to lament and just to be there to listen. Maybe, again, it's about noticing, not diagnosing, just to be there to help people to process, perhaps. But if that's not happening, maybe we need to be the initiators of that. But also, where is that happening in sacred spaces? Where are people naturally lamenting? Again, perhaps beyond lockdown times, but in the park, in the queue for the fish and chip shop, on the school run, wherever it is, where are people just talking and churning over what's happened? And maybe out of that lament space, if we can do some really great noticing, we might, I think, see the prophetic for the future coming through those spaces of lament. Celebration will come, of course it will, but I think the lament's quite an important part of that journey. And the last thing is, maybe we need different ways of thinking about what it means to be fruitful. And again, there's some great work going on in the Church of England looking at this, which will come later, hopefully this year, I think. But sometimes we're very much about measuring things in terms of quantitative things, aren't we? In terms of what we can see, what we can count. But sometimes life isn't like that. And particularly in pioneer ministry, there's often not a lot to see. There's all this internal work going under the surface that you can't see it or measure it, but it's still there. So maybe it's thinking about, if you're going to try and sort of think about what's going on, how fruitful are you being, how is God using you, I would maybe not just start with counting what's going on, but maybe there are other things that we could measure. The depth of conversations that we've had with people, the questions people have asked us, how the community is connecting us together in different ways. I mean, there could be loads and loads of things that we could measure in a different way to see where is fruitfulness happening. We might need to think a little bit differently. So in a moment, I'll just check the questions, see if there are any other questions there. But we've thought about pivoting, what it means. We've thought about the idea of gift, difference, and interdependence in terms of some theologies. We thought about riding a bike and what that might involve, which links to these 15 principles, the foundations, the inward qualities, and the outward practices. Thought a little bit about how pioneers are living this out, and then just a bit of reflection there at the end, thinking about what that might mean in this pandemic time and beyond, and maybe our mindset needs to shift a little bit in those spaces in order for us to do something that might be pioneering. So looking at the chat, there's a question about funding there. Funding is always quite tricky, and I think it maybe taps into those themes I was mentioning earlier about the entrepreneurial pioneer. I know it depends what kind of church you're part of. It depends, I guess, what denomination you're part of, if you are. So I know some in the Church of England, some dioceses will have growth funds where you can apply to start a project in some way, or some dioceses may have some funding for training. Training is always really tricky to fund. But as well as that, maybe it's thinking about are there other ways that also funding could be generated? Maybe you could generate funding as a community for something. Maybe you could generate funding in a co-vocational way or in an entrepreneurial way. I mean, it's not for everybody. So I guess work out what's available and think about also how you could be part of maybe generating some funding. I think it's the whole of I'm sure much of the world, certainly in the UK, we're in a slightly tricky economic time, aren't we? There's going to be increasingly lots and lots of pressures on funds and funding for many, many, many things. It's a very challenging time. So we may need to be more creative. It might be that our normal sources of funding perhaps aren't always there, but it very much depends on your local context and your local specific place. So I would start there. I can't see any more questions on our live stream, so I think it's probably time to finish. Thank you so much for those who joined in live. Thank you for those who might be watching this afterwards. If you've got questions as you're watching this later on that you want to post in the Facebook chat, then do that. I'll try and keep an eye on those, and maybe I can answer some of those on Facebook later. But it's been really great to talk to you, and I hope you would consider in some way what it means to pivot into a pioneering mindset.